It's an honor to be here. I'm going to go through some slides, and I think in a funny way, this is one of the charts that captures everything you need to know about the economy. And why do I focus so much on the economy? The economy is the rising tide or the falling tide that affects all ships. And while it doesn't affect every ship equally, we've done a lot of research, it affects them all. There's nobody, no economy, there's no local economy, there's no type of real estate immune from that tide. Some more exposed than others. And so by following it, you get a real insight. I also view looking at the economy like looking at a Seurat painting, where there's a lot of little dots. None of them mean anything in and of themselves, but hopefully if you get enough dots, you get some semblance of what the story in the picture is going on. So this is, in the red, is the long-term trend in real GDP. Anytime I say real, I simply mean adjust for inflation, right? And by the way, it's based on 69 to 2007. You could go back to 1800 and it will look the same. 1800, that's a long time. And the exact line will be a little different, it'll look the same. The blue is actual GDP, and you can see sometimes it's above the line, sometimes it's below the line, and sometimes it's really below the line. This is the greatest below the line since the Great Depression. The Great Depression closed the gap between the line and itself in about 12 years. Okay? And of course, no one thought it would ever close the gap. By the way, it's been above the gap as much as 8 and 10% at various times since 1800. And it can be above the line for 10 or 12 years. But it has always come back to the line. It's a very interesting phenomenon. The line is, by the way, nothing more than a little under 1% population growth a year, and for those already here, about 2% productivity growth. That's it. And if you think about 2% productivity growth, it says half of us in any year have no productivity growth, and half of us have about 4%. And that kind of fits the smell test. You know, it's not a crazy kind of thing. And that's sort of why it comes back to the line. You can deviate for a while, but that's all it is. This captures why people feel good and bad at the same time. Why do you feel good and bad? You feel good because the blue is at an all-time high. There's never been a richer, large economy in the history of the world. On a total basis, on a per capita basis, on a per household basis, never been. And as you can see, much higher than it was 10 years ago, right before the crash, right? I mean, much higher. That's the good news. What's the bad news? The bad news is this enormous gap. And it's like driving on the Autobahn at 100 miles an hour or 90 miles an hour, and you get really used to it, and you come off and you're only going 40. And it's not like you're doing mathematics to figure that out, but something feels wrong, right? Or if you're on an expressway and you're only going 20 miles an hour and you know you should be doing 60. It has that. So what you have here is the disconnect. We're doing okay, but we should be doing better. That gap is $3.2 trillion. $3.2 trillion. Imagine our economy had $3.2 trillion more in it. How many more sales that would be, how many more rental apartments, you know, just kind of work it through, right? That's a lot of economic activity. Half of that is basically due to single-family housing. Normally, by this point in the cycle, single-family is way above normal, and at this point, it's still only about 80% of normal. Come back to that. But that, everybody follow what I say about it captures. This is real median income. You hear that the middle has been hollowed out. It's bullshit. This is median income. Okay? Anybody see it flattening? Anybody see it flat? I mean, it's rising. By the way, does it have periods where it goes relatively flat? And you see a very simple trend line. All that's there to help your eye, so you don't have to do it in your head. It's growing. And in fact, anybody who says the middle is not growing just isn't looking. Not everyone is, but the middle is growing. And some of you go back to what a lifestyle in this area was like for the median household 40 years ago. Any of you who think they had it better then than today just isn't paying attention. So the median is growing, and in fact, just a teeny tiny above that trend line. There's nothing magic about the trend, but all I'm saying is nothing abnormal, okay, in that regard. Consumer confidence. This is an important chart, I think, about how much legs the economy has to go. Recessions do not occur unless people are overconfident. You don't get hit by a car if all you're doing is looking for a car. When you get hit by a car is when you think you can't possibly get hit by a car. The red line is historic average consumer confidence. You can see we've only since the last year and a half popped above. The big pop was post-election, right? And it's only starting to appear in consumer behavior and business behavior. It's not long enough. When recessions occur is when you believe they cannot occur. When people start talking about a new norm. When everybody's buying a Maserati, right? Those are the kind of moments when recessions occur. Everybody's not buying Maseratis, and lots of people believe a recession could occur tomorrow. And that caution is kind of a self-regulating damper. It will occur because we're humans. I don't think we've grown immune to overconfidence, but it hasn't occurred yet. It's going to take another couple of years of that. Small business optimism had been below average. The red is the average. Small business had been below average, shot up post-election. Why did, almost all of you are small businesses, why did it go up? Small business, I did a study in 1979, small businesses get killed by regulations. They get killed for two reasons. One, we don't have big departments to handle them. And two, we don't lobby, but big companies lobby against us. So if there's going to be a regulation, the big guys get in there, lobby, and use it as an attempt to change the terms of competition. It's pretty well known. Small business was really being crushed by regulations. Regulations by normal metrics were double, over the last 9 years, double their historic norm, new regulatory incentives. If you think about how regulations slow the economy, two ways. You're spending money on lobbying and lawyers and compliance instead of innovation. It's that simple. And two, some of them are anti-growth by their very nature. It doesn't mean they're bad regulations, but you're going to get a drag on growth. We've now, so far this last year, we are running half of the historic norm of regulations, new regulations. By the way, we're getting more, just half the normal rate. So that's a big change, and you're seeing small business react. Economic policy uncertainties, an index of economic policies and how uncertain are we. You see the historic norm, we were way above for an extended period of time. And that was largely driven by new regulations. I don't know what they're going to be. I don't know if they're good or bad. I have to adjust to them. By the way, they could be good, but I still have to adjust to them. I made a speech about 8 years ago when Obamacare was introduced, and I said, the current health system is shit. The new one's going to be shit. It's just different shit. And we're going to have to adjust to it, right? And I have to pay to get there. To the adjustment, and it's a drag. And I'm being facetious, but you get the spirit I'm trying to drive home. Interestingly, the uncertainty is about average right now. Pre-election, it was high. That's always the case. Came down. I don't think there's a chance in hell a major tax bill gets passed. They'll declare it was a major tax bill because they got to go on the road and get elected. And if you're opposed to it, you got to say, I did everything I could to stop it, and that's why you got to elect me to get rid of them. And if you're for, you know, I did it. The reason is, in the last 60 years, there's been one truly major tax reform. One. And there's a reason. It's difficult. And the only one occurred with a very strong president in the first year of his second term with bipartisan support. And a very charismatic leader, both in the House in Tip O'Neill and in the presidency. And they used every chip they had to get a major reform. Okay? Does that sound like today's environment? So they'll tweak, I don't know, they'll tweak the exemption on estate tax. There's no revenue there. They'll lower the marginal tax rate, but the marginal tax rate isn't much money on the corporate. There's not much money there. So it will encourage business at the margin, but it won't lose much revenue. They'll get a lower tax on repatriating profits from abroad because that's a pure revenue gain. It's not coming here anyway. They'll tweak, and that's what always happens. You talk big. Maybe I'm wrong. I think we need a major, but it's hard. A lot of horse trading, a lot of vested interest, and a weak president politically with weak leadership in Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both houses. I just don't see it happen, and they didn't make it their #1 priority. And remember, they all go for it, not all. The entire House and 34 senators start campaigning February. All right? So if it's not done by then, they got to do their real job. What's their real job? Get elected. Okay, so I don't think a big. Corporate profits. The red is distribution. Just think of dividends. It's not just dividends, and the blue is after tax, right? Flat, high but flat. And that's not unusual by this point in a cycle. Namely, the benefits of productivity go to labor late in the cycle. Early in the cycle, they go to capital. And this has just been one more. Another way to say it is, in 2009, the only person you sent to a conference was somebody who was really important. In 2018, you send everybody in the office. Right? I'm just why? Because you got to keep your workers happy, right? You got to give them some perks. So this is not unusual, but it's tough to grow profits right now. And it will remain tough for another year or two to grow profits. This is private sector employment. I put a red line just to help your eye at the previous high. Private sector employment, all-time high. All right? We have a lot of employment. We were adding jobs at about 2 to 2.2 million jobs a year, which isn't bad for an economy that's only adding about 2.8 million people a year. You got to think about that for a moment. For how long can I add 2.2 million jobs a year if we only are adding 2.8 million people a year? And the answer is you can't do it forever. We can do it obviously because we have this backlog, if you will, right? That we're working through, and there's a lot of people who have dropped out of the labor force. Growing, reasonably healthy. I think it will continue to grow. This is the unemployment rate for young and for everybody, both near all-time lows. Okay. Now, why do I put the youth? The youth are hyper-reactors, right? They're easy not to hire in bad times and easy to get rid of in bad times. And it's very easy to, if I called and I said, will you hire my 17-year-old? In an economy like this, if I'm a friend, you'll say yes. If it's a bad time, I probably wouldn't even ask you, right, unless it was critical. So they're hyper-reactors, and you can see how dramatically that's come down. It's solid labor market, all right? And those are low skills, right? Those are low-skilled people there, so it's a quick barometer that way. And if you only watch one dot, and everybody in this room can watch this dot, it comes out every week. This is not from a survey. This is not from, it's not released with a lag. Every week, everybody who files a new unemployment claim, and they file to get their money, and it's reported on a weekly basis how many filed last week. It's contemporaneous data, and it's not a survey. It's not a sample. It's the real deal. The red line shows you the average, and the other two are just markers for high or low. It has not basically ever been this low since the early 70s, and the labor force is almost double the size. So we essentially have the same number of claims on twice as big a labor force. Got the picture. This is very strong. When you worry about this is when it rises for about 6 to 8 weeks in a row considerably and starts getting above 300,000. By the way, you will not even have a GDP estimate yet for that quarter. You won't have an employment number for another month. Okay? This is real time. So pay attention to this number of where it's at. You can see it's very low. You see that blip? That blip was the hurricanes. So very strong labor market. This is an important chart for a lot of stuff, and we can maybe talk about it a little, but people don't understand life expectancy in the Western world. I include Japan in the Western world, has been rising at 6 to 7 weeks pretty steadily for the last 130 years. That has big ramifications. I was saying at lunch, which is instead of 65-year-olds being spent physically, emotionally, financially, at the age of 65, they're looking at another 20 to 25 years of growth. They have double the income of millennials and 4 to 6 times their wealth. Start thinking about them, because there are about the same number of them as there are millennials with a lot more money. A lot more money. So, and I was saying at lunch, you might think about all of you shopping center people who put in narrow striping at your shopping centers. You know what you basically said to those people? Don't shop here. That's basically what you told them. By the way, if your shopping center played oompa music, what did you say to millennials? Don't shop here. If you make it difficult to get in and out of cars for 65 to 80-year-old people, you basically said, do not shop here. Never thought about it. And there's a million other variants of this. By the way, those of you in the senior housing business, this is important. Historically, you'd said the seniors start looking at senior housing around age 75, but it moves up 6 weeks a year. Okay, moving up 6 weeks a year. And by the way, the lead edge of the baby boom is 71. If people aren't moving into senior housing until they're 75 or 76, it means you're still 5 years away. And there's a reason they were called the baby boom, and that was because them was a low demographic from the Great Depression and World War II. Actually, it was a great demographic in the Philippines and in Britain, but not in the United States during that time. So this is an important thing, and I urge you, if you took away one deep thought, start thinking about what that means. And I'll take myself as an example. I have 2 artificial hips and a surgically repaired eye. Okay? 40 years ago, at the age of 66, I would not have been able to walk for the last 6 years, and I would have been blind in one eye. So when I talk about people being spent, right, that's the kind of thing, and I'm not the only one, there are lots, right? It's a whole different kind of exercise in many ways. Labor force participation rate of this group. They're living longer, not surprisingly, they're working longer, they're participating in work. This could easily be up to 40% within the next decade. So that the retirement age you historically think about is kind of being blown through, and not just by a few, quote, rich people who have cushy jobs. What else are you going to do? And by the way, I got to pay for myself, and by the way, I got to pay for the lazy-ass millennial. Because there's about 2 million male millennials. This is based on a study by economists from Chicago and Stanford. They believe there's 2 million millennial males who are sitting in their parents' home playing video games 8 hours a day, have no interest in going to work. And they have higher satisfaction levels in their life than their counterparts. Very interesting phenomenon. So, this is real household wealth to the extent it's above the trend and below the trend. And I'm just trying to give you a sense again of, are we in a hot time or a cold time or a normal? So you can see there have been periods in the late 60s and in the dot-com, and then again in the right before the crisis where wealth was way above norm. And you can see there are periods right after and right after and right after these crashes where it's well below. We're above. Does the level it's above strike fear into your heart? Not yet, but give us time, right? Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and if I suddenly say his jacket is worth double what he just bought it for, it's worth double. Right? It really is. And everybody in the room marks their jacket to that value. Right? So you get those types of phenomena. One idiot buys his coat and everybody marks it up. So we're not to that kind of territory yet. We may be moving. How leveraged are we? This is household debt as a percent of disposable income. The red is a long-term trend. You see we got way above it. Way over leveraged. And now, if anything, we're under leveraged. And by the way, I'm not saying everything is trend. I'm just trying to give you all I'm using trend is as kind of normalcy, for lack of a better. If you look at that, you'd say, wow, if anything, we're being quite frugal. Right? Which means people have a good deal of cushion. You add to that that a lot of their debt is either mortgage debt or student loan, both of which are long term. A lot less credit card debt than we used to have, which is high interest rate and constantly having to be turned over. So their balance sheets are in much better shape. This is the student loan of the consumer debt. And you see the credit cards in the dark blue and the student loans in the light blue, and auto loans in between. And one of the things you'll see is student loans have gone up a lot, but part of what it did was just squeeze out credit card debt. And I was saying again at lunch, student loan is the ultimate deal if you think about it. It's cheap. It's not even interest only while they're in school. It can be legally forgiven in many cases, and they don't collect it very thoroughly. Sign me up, right? And as opposed to all the other kind of debt, where you start paying right away, and it's not long term, and you have to, and you have to. So you can see that the debt is up, but it's not actually up versus income. This is 10-year treasuries and the Fed fund rate, the short rate. Actually, I think it's 30-day treasury, but 30-day treasury, and you can see the dramatic rise in interest rates. And interest rates up to 1.16% on inflation of 2%. That's absurd. It's absurd. It's called a spade a spade. It's absurd. Not as absurd as when inflation was 2% and the rate was 0. The Fed believed they knew better how to save the economy. If you believe that, why don't we put them in charge of setting apartment rents while we're at it? Well, seriously, if they're so all-knowing, why don't we put them in charge of setting apartment rents? Right? I'm sure they can do that. Nobody knows what the price should be. It should be better than inflation, though. And it isn't because they've artificially said it isn't. That blue line single-handedly crushed single-family recovery. The way it single-handedly stopped it is, it's not about the monthly payment, it's about the down payment. Now imagine real people, not the people in this room, real people. And they retire with a lifetime saving of $400,000. What do they invest in? Office buildings? Hedge funds? REITs? No, what do they invest in? 6-month to 2-year CDs? Bank accounts, checking accounts, and money market. How much money have they made on their lifetime saving in the last 9 years? Zero. Zero. What was the source of the down payment for a lot of young people historically? Transfers from the older generation. When you wiped out the income that was being received to the amount of $12,000 to $15,000, think of a grandmother getting $12,000 to $15,000 a year. For 7 or 8 years, she could have given $10,000 to $15,000 a year to each of her 5 grandchildren. $10,000 to $15,000 to each of her 5 grandchildren to help them on their down payment. You know how she helps them on their down payment now? She dies. She hadn't got the income to give them. It's only when she dies and they get the money, they can, and that's why you slowly see the home purchase go up. It is all about down payment. It's not about the monthly. They're paying the monthly somewhere. The apartment owners, they're paying the monthly. Many of your rents are higher than P&I, right? Which is a very odd situation. They essentially put 100% tax. The government essentially put 100% tax, de facto, on money markets, CDs, bank accounts, and savings accounts. They put 100% tax on it, to the tune of some number like $2.2 trillion taken away from those people. Those people were real people that would have done real things. Who were the beneficiaries? This room, people who borrowed a lot. But that's not core America. So what you saw is people who did, core America struggled, because they had $2.2 trillion in income they lost. And people who benefited from the $2.2 trillion, right, the borrowers, did $2.2 trillion better. Not rocket science. So some sectors did quite well, some people did quite well, but it was an overt tax policy if you think about it. This is another thing. At a zero interest rate, there is no urgency and no penalty to sitting on your money. All right? So you can see the trend in red in cash essentially. You can see the blue is pretty close to it most of the time, and you can see it's not so close. It's 2.3 trillion above the trend. By the way, okay, maybe it's 1.5 trillion if you have a different trend line. Maybe it's 2.5 trillion if you have a different trend line. If you have 2 trillion, and instead of, this is above normal, right? This is above normal. If you have that 2 trillion invested, generating 10% return, it's $200 billion a year extra in the economy being generated each year. Each year. And that 200 billion generates going forward. You start seeing how the gap occurs, right? The gap occurs, and you start seeing why probably a third of that would have gone into down payments, right? Just could have and would have gone into down payments for single-family homes. Multifamily, this is multifamily versus normal production levels. This is national. And you can see that it's a shortfall. It was a shortfall of about 1 million units versus historic norms, cumulative. Okay? We were actually destroying more units than we were building in 2009, 10, and 11. And now we're building more. And now we're building above the average, so you can see the shortfall kind of narrowed, but only a little bit. The problem is, you have to be careful. I can tell you that there's 900,000 shortfall. By the way, suppose you say it's half of that. Fine, it's 500,000 shortfall. But this corner has got too many. And that corner really has not enough. And in reality, what's that meant in most places in the United States over the last 3 years, not over the early part, over the last 3 years is too many urban core and not enough suburban, right? Everybody wanted, by the way, there is demand for urban core. It's not like there isn't demand, but if I build 1.1 for every one needed, you get sloppy pretty quick. Not awful, you just get sloppy. And that's kind of what happens. So there are some markets that are tight, some markets that are loose. Urban core in particular is loose in the major markets. Single family starts, this is single family, you see the long term, even if you, we've more than doubled from the bottom. This is the slowest recovery. Normally we would be 30 to 40% above norm at this point. Normally single family would be feeding the excess, and the reason it isn't feeding the excess is the Fed kept the interest rates down. By keeping the interest rate down, I can't do the down payment. Can't do the down payment, I rent. By the way, you know the people who bought single family housing to rent? What they effectively did was front the down payment, right? They fronted the down payment. So they didn't lend it, they wanted the upside. They fronted the down payment. But the difference is, historically, most owners, if you kind of unravel it, want some return like 5% on their money for owning a home, and Blackstone wants 18, 20%. So you took something that was historically a low-cost item, and by robbing it of the down payment, you said, okay, now I'm going to have Blackstone provide it. You said we went from having a low source of money for that to a high source of money. This is the cumulative shortage of single family. Starts at 0, the housing bubble gets it over 2 million, and then we stop producing homes. And we have a shortfall of almost 3 million homes at this point nationally. We're starting building them. This is real quick. I won't go into how I did this, but this is real dollar sales on a monthly basis, but it's real dollar sales through bricks, as best you can tell. And you can see kind of flat, flat, flat. So the throughput of bricks is flat. That means if his center's doing well, mine's got to be doing less than well. Just automatically. It means the stronger get strong and the weaker get weak, because there's no growth to cover it up. There's not a lot of development. There's no growth to cover it up. This is very different than the picture most people think, right? Most people think it's just falling off a cliff. Now, it is true. This is, and he really only pays attention from 2004 forward. The back is irrelevant to this. 2004 forward, you can see this is the internet. This is internet taken from bricks. It's rising quite rapidly. It has one slight problem, which is they lose money on it. But other than that, it's a hell of a business for which they get a 250 multiple. So cars, there's a good way to tell the state of the auto market. There's a lot of ways, but one of them is, what's the average age of the cars versus the trend line? The trend line's upward because of technology. Better cars, right? They last longer. Some of you are old enough to remember where a car making it to 100,000 miles was like, and now 200,000 all the time, right? So that's why the trend line's positive. When you're below it, everybody's buying new cars. When you're above it, no one's buying new cars. And you can see the ages come back down because people are buying cars that they forestalled. This could be a very different next hiccup. The red is the actual lending by banks, not just to real estate, the actual lending by banks. The blue is what they're statutorily allowed to lend. And historically, the banks always lent everything they statutorily could. Why not, right? You can see that we have a $15 trillion gap that's been created by these stress tests you read about. The stress tests are not statutory, and it's like saying, I'm not going to tell you what the tax law is. You have to file a tax return. You have to pay the right amount of tax. I'm going to change the tax structure monthly, but I'm not going to tell you what it is, and if you fail, I'm going to put you in jail. That's how the stress tests that you read about are done. They're not transparent. They do change. You're not told what they are. It's kind of fundamentally undemocratic if you think about it, having a law that you're supposed to abide by. And of course they say if we tell you, you'll game it. But we game speed limits, we game tax laws, we game all laws, right? But you're supposed to know. That's largely created by the stress test. Why could it be different? Normally, if he doesn't pay his loan, the bank has two problems historically. One, I don't have any money to lend, right? Because he didn't give it to me to lend back to him or somebody else. So there was a cash, and it got regulatory treatment that said, and I got to take some more money away to account for it. And by the way, when the red and the blue are on top of one another, I don't have any of that money. I got staggering amounts. So when he doesn't pay this time, yeah, I have a shortfall, but I got 15 trillion that I can use to keep going. So it could have a very different tenor. These are C&I loans are, think of lines of credit, not to real estate, but well, could be real estate, but and you see it's up and down and it's doing well. The red are commercial mortgages, not residential mortgages, including multifamily, held by banks. They're not back to their previous peak, right? They've risen, but they're not back to their previous peak. You'll sometimes hear they're higher, they're not higher because you've had 10 years of inflation. So if they're the same number today as 10 years ago, 2% a year, 10 years, real quick, 24% less, right? That's the spirit of what's going on. And this is square footage. And a square foot in New York is different than a square footage here, although depends how you measure it too, I guess, right? And this hit a real low and grew. And then those of you in the business know what you saw about 18 months ago is banks pulled back a little from their development lending, right? If they were going to lend you 70%, they pulled it back to 64%. If they're going to lend you 75%, they pulled it back to 68%. They didn't pull it away, right? And suddenly everybody had to scramble around to fill that part of the capital stack. And you went from having floating rate debt at 4 to equity at 18%. And it may have only been 5 to 7% of the capital stack, but that's a lot. And so that has actually put a damper on things. And so far, we seem fairly restrained. So I think they're being very cautious, but looking, can they lock in quality spreads on some quality real estate? I don't mean trophy, but quality. You then go to the people who are not so much in the real estate business, but are money managers who specialize in real estate, and their job is always be in the market, right? Imagine if you sent your money to Vanguard to put in their REIT, and they said, no, we don't think it's the right time, we're going to sit on it. And you said, I didn't give it to you for that, right? So I think the people who are real money managers, and I'm not taking anything away from them, they're spectacularly successful people, they've decided they always have to be in the market because vintage effects are so big, and you can never particularly predict the vintage, so you got to always be in the market. Otherwise, you could miss what turned out to have been a good vintage.
You just outperform your vintage.
That's all you have to do is, or at least pretend you outperformed your vintage. Right. And then I think you run into the entrepreneurs who have to play with other people's money as well as their own, and it's hard. It doesn't mean you can't find opportunities, but look, the market has gotten more efficient. You were a student as it was beginning. We talked about it then, how, and it's not efficient, but it's more efficient. And so you used to be able to own the best shopping center in town as an entrepreneur. That makes no sense today, right? You get outbid. The only reason a best shopping center in town is owned by an entrepreneur is they can't afford to deal with the tax, right? So they hang on even though they'd rather sell, right? And somewhat for the best office and the best work. So what's happening is the entrepreneur gets pushed farther down the food chain of quality, which is a little unfamiliar to them, and it's not obvious. And the capital sources for them went out in 4 years. And real estate is a bad asset for 4 years. So you kind of, as an entrepreneur, struggle with, I need to do something, but 4 years is a demanding report card. And
so what do we do? I'm in that bucket.
What most of them are doing is probably half the deals they would like to be doing, but enough to stay busy, truthfully. And working harder than you would normally have to work at this point in the cycle. Yeah, although one of the things that happens every cycle is there are fewer and fewer entrepreneurs who like development. I mean, if you go back to when your dad started in the business, everybody was a developer. Today, there are fewer each time around. There's still plenty of them. Fewer, and that's because I think zoning and approvals have gotten more sophisticated, time-taking, staff requiring, et cetera.
And we don't like recourse.
And the recourse part, right. And I think too many people have bitten at the recourse apple and said, I don't know, I'd rather not. Let's stay on the debt side first. There's a lot of debt out there, and there's staggering amounts of debt. For almost everything, it's just that it's 5% less than you'd like, right? So whatever your natural instinct is, you want 70%. They're only going to give 65. You want 75, they're only going to give 70. And again, normally at this cycle, it's the other way around. You thought you wanted 70, they say 75, please, you know? And so it's a little self-governing that way. It's almost working the way debt is supposed to. We'll see if that continues. Namely, they don't get any upside. So why should they take that risk, right? So there's plenty of debt for almost everything, but not quite as much as you'd want. And the problem is so much of the equity is expensive equity. Think about the pullback. The pullback went from a 70% loan to a 65% loan. My equity partner wanted a 20% return on their 30% of the capital stack. They still want a 20% return on their 25% of the capital stack. Well, the 20 or 35, and it's not as risky. So there's a mismatch, right? If you were happy with a 20% return on the top 30% of the capital stack, you should be thrilled with an 18 if all you're going to do is, but that's a gap. So there's a lot of debt. The equity is odd. There's a lot of equity for real core. There's a lot of, especially in the big markets, big bites. There is a lot of equity for if you can make a legitimate 20, kind of believe. But making a legitimate 20 is hard. I've worked for a lot of legendary investors over the years, and I invariably ask them, tell me what you've done over the long term. These are legends, real legends. And the typical answer is 12. And yet every one of us underwrite 20 like it's, like you're going to hit a home run every time up. There's a reason they're legends and have done kind of sustained 12s, right? And especially in this low rate environment. So the gap comes about, everybody on the, not everybody, a lot of people want 20s. The problem for entrepreneurs on the core or core plus stuff is the promote structure doesn't work.
You need scale.
Well, I need a return. What, am I supposed to go to the investor and say, I get 20% over 5 as the hurdle? I mean, that makes no sense, right? So 20% over a 10 might make sense, but 20% over a 5? Well, what's in it for you except the fee, which is something? So that's a bit of a disconnect. If you have world quality assets, there's a lot of money out there. Everybody thinks they have world quality assets. Everybody thinks they have brilliant children.
I mean, one of the one of the things we're seeing is the traditional opportunity funds have gone out and raised core plus capital to basically buy the same assets at lower return thresholds. Do you see that kind of capital coming to a market like Phoenix?
And it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing because not everything can be 20s. I mean, it should be hard. 20s should be really hard.
Do you think a market like Phoenix can be put in that bucket for more than malls and multifamily?
Only for a very limited set of assets. And the reason is, how many cities like Phoenix do you know of in China? Name cities like, when I say Phoenix, I mean a vibrant place with real people and a real economy. What cities can you name in China? Right? They're the 3 or 4 headline cities. What cities can you name in Japan? They're the 3. What cities can you name in the Middle East? They're the 3 or 4 cities. What cities can they name in the United States? Right?
And pronouncing is a completely different issue.
And a completely thing. And Phoenix is easy. Unfortunately, Egypt's not doing so well. So if it was, they could get Philadelphia and Phoenix because they're old Egyptian places. But the rest is hard, right? Wow, some of you must have gone to Harvard. You didn't get the Phoenix and Philadelphia and Egyptian references. Wow. No. So I think some cities just face, I don't want to say insurmountable, but how do you really expect them? If I said you had to invest $1 billion, I know the cities you'd look at outside the United States. I just know because you've heard of them. You can find data about them. You can visit them. You can fly nonstop. You don't have to use a camel, and so forth. It's not so different. Well, theoretically, age restricted, the 55 and over, I think are doing a pretty good job. They actually kind of figured out, they stumbled into it. Remember, the 55 is only because of the law. You can legally discriminate at that. They kind of figured out that I want to discriminate against people who are below 55 and not let them in. And they kind of figured out that They aren't ready to die. So they sort of stumbled into it. I think the rest of the real estate business is unaware.
Is that an opportunity?
I think it's a huge opportunity that's only going to get bigger. I'll stay with retail is, do you understand how big healthcare is going to become? You haven't seen anything yet. You haven't seen anything yet. The leading edge of the baby boom is only 71. So eye clinics, follows up for eyes. Had to get a heart checked out recently. I thought I was in God's waiting room, you know, and these people were 85 and 90. Your shopping centers, your office buildings, you haven't thought of them being that kind of stuff. And I think you're missing a big sector. Now the problem is, how do you do it without turning off? Well, the malls faced that problem a long time ago with teenagers. How do I make the mall an attractive place without turning, you know, without the teenagers turning people off? And you found ways to do it. It took probably a decade of real work to find how to do it. You're in that early phase of how do you get seniors in to whatever your asset is. And I'm not talking about senior housing. I'm thinking more retail and office, medical and such. How do I get them in without making it feel like a senior citizens facility? And I don't know the answer, but people know when they're not welcome. People know instinctively when they're not being considered. And that's why I give the parking one. It's so obvious. You know, she's young. She has no trouble squeezing out of the narrow parking space. She's young and small. Now take the 72-year-old who's not so young, not so supple, and a little over. They have a hard time getting out. They know instinctively they're not wanted, and you don't go where you're not wanted. So I think it's start from scratch on your product saying, we were talking about where's the demand for office. Demand for office is medical. Now that's not every building. It does say that a lot of buildings that are right now not medical probably should be because of where they sit. But they weren't big medical sites at that point, but now they are. They should be reconstituted and some of it backfills away from them. I'm not saying every building has it, right? But the retail one is such an obvious example. How do you suck the money out of them? And I know you're not going to suck the money out of them if they don't feel comfortable there.
Well, feeding them seems to be a solution that a lot of people
It is a
going
partial solution, and then yet you're left with the same problem you have with teenagers. I like the fact that they're eating there, but I don't want anybody to see them. Right? It's exactly the teenager problem, and you've got to come to grips with that. Again, this is design issues, this is ambiance issues, this is, you know, so forth. Here's my Shark Tank pitch. We're going to take items that have a gross sale price of $20, that have a net margin of $4, pre-overhead, right? $4. We're going to have somebody who gets paid $12 an hour handle it for 15 minutes, so do the math. Then what we're going to do is ship it overnight and have them ship it back to us at our expense. And when it gets back, we're not going to have any margin left. So I'm not going to pay somebody $12 an hour to handle it. We're going to throw it out. You want to sign up? That's it. Now, by the way, if it's a $800 item and the margin is several $100s, the math is different. But the typical American blouse, I'm not talking about the typical high-end blouse, is 20 bucks, some number like that. It's not, and that's the math. And it's going to get more, so they don't make money on it. They make money on online deliveries. Amazon never made money selling books or videos until they figured out how to deliver them online. Then they made a little money on them. It's a niche. They made money and they really killed those retailers. What they've got is a model where everybody likes the convenience as long as they don't have to pay for it. So right now, by the way, for most things we buy, you've got to pay a price that somebody makes money on it. and you're not paying a price for online purchases with real delivery that they're making money on. But other than that, it's a hell of a model. How long can it last? I don't know. I don't have a 250 multiple for anything I own, right? So, and in fact, you go one step further. Some of you may have Whole Foods in your centers. By the way, a year ago, if I'd have said you have a Whole Foods in your center, what were you saying? Shit retailer, can't make it. They're probably going to go out of business. I'm going to be left with an empty store. They can't make it. Their day has passed, right? That would have been the conversation literally a year ago. Now you'd have thought Amazon buys them and sprinkles fairy dust, and what, they're the greatest retailer in the history of mankind? What? How did that work? I mean, this is a tough business. I said, I have no idea. Amazon has a real business in the cloud service. That's when they began making money on the cloud service. 2 years ago, nobody in this room paid a dime for any cloud services, personal or corporate. And today, all of us pay both. And it's a tolling model. You don't even know how much you're paying. Right? It's like self-storage. I don't even know what I'm paying. I'm just paying this. I don't even know what it's for. I get a note that they took 32 cents out of my bill. And we say, fine, it's only 32 cents a day. And then so you go, and so that's a real business. That's a warehouse business in the sky, so to speak. That's a real business. I'm not talking about that. And selling memberships is a real business. That's as old as the hills. Some of you old enough to remember the Columbia Record Club? You know, where you'd sign up for 20 bucks and they'd send you your records for half the cost, but they hoped you'd never have any money to order them because you'd go out of business. They'd go out of business if you did. And they were right, because we couldn't wait to get the new Rolling Stones records, so we never ordered from them. And then they got crushed when our parents started buying Mitch Miller on our membership, you know, and they actually were willing to wait, and they got murdered, right? So memberships have been around a long time. It's a model. It's a viable model. It's not about retailing. It's about membership, right? So they make money on those two things. They make a little money on third-party procurement for other companies that can't make money shipping $20 blouses profitably. So instead of losing $5, they only lose $4. But it's an odd situation. It's a very odd situation. But at a 250 multiple, who cares? And they could drive a lot of companies out of business because they don't have to make money. I said, imagine a Saudi sheikh's son who likes looking at women dressing in lingerie, so they're running a lingerie store where they're giving the items away for free because they want the women to come in and they like looking at them, right? And you're actually trying to run a lingerie store to make money. You'll go out of business because they're not in it for profit. That's a bit what's happening with Amazon.
Talk about the postal component.
The postal is a very interesting thing. I think around 40 to 45% of all the boxes are delivered by the United States Postal Service. The United States Postal Service, by statute, sets rates by the percent of their business that is represented by first class versus second class versus, okay? The last time they set those allocations was about 15 years ago. If you'd have set those allocations 15 years ago, first class is way up here and boxes are way down here. So the overhead allocated to boxes is very low, therefore the cost of shipping a box is very low because they don't fully attribute the current. When they next market, it's going to be the reverse, because first class is going to be down here, boxes are going to be way up here, and the overhead is still way up. And people have estimated it's an unintended subsidy of about $1.40 to $1.50 a box. Now think about that, going each way on an item with a $4 or $5 margin. That's already losing money. And the Postal Service will change that by statute at some point. They're not trying to subsidize them, but it's one of those funny things that happens. The truth is, they basically don't know what to make of it. They go to conferences, and there's always some whiz-bang there who does not understand real estate but really understands technology. I mean this very seriously. And the whiz-bang does a conference presentation, and everybody goes, oh my God, I feel like I'm living in the dark ages. And they come back to the office and say, we got to do something, Gary. We got to. This guy was talking about how we can turn addresses into, and we can track, and we can do, and we got all these people. And they don't know what to do with it, is the real truth. It's not a very mobile activity. If you think about it, it's not where you get a lot of information is something like retail, where there's a lot of trading and very poor targeting. Your tenant's there for 9 months or 10 months. I mean, what? You're going to monitor them each time they get in their car? I mean, that's creepy. So they don't, truthfully, they don't know what to do. By the way, in the back office, they know what to do. And what they know to do in the back office is spend an ungodly amount of money to have a system that after you've spent it still doesn't give you the information you want. Does that sound familiar? You continually spend ungodly amounts of money, and yet you still don't have now you have much better information. I've been on the board of companies that for 15 years have told us we're almost there. You say, well, you told me that $3 million ago last year. And well, we're almost. But seriously, I think they're doing fine in the back office part, but in the customer sense or in the generate revenue sense, I have not met anybody who's really got a notable model. WeWorks talks about having it, but by the way, if I ever have to sell anything in my life, I would like Adam from WeWorks to sell it. He's the greatest salesman.
Would you be short WeWorks right now?
Oh God, yes. But that's even if they have a great concept, that's a separate matter, right? But he's a great salesman. He's sold people on a vision. That's not so easy to do when your vision is shared office space at 3 times the rent that I could take a first lease on.
It's not that hard to imitate.
Not that hard to imitate, and very cyclical and so. But God bless if he can.
We have time for a couple questions from the audience. Anyone?
Okay, so now we were talking about that today. I could be wrong. I'm just, giving you my view. The government is a powerful beast to turn and an easy beast to abuse, right? I mean, that's history in a lot of ways. Which side of this argument would you prefer to be speaking as a congressperson? The statistics show that the automobile is safer when driving without a driver than with a driver, and give all the data? Or would you rather be saying an auto without a driver just knocked down and killed 4 school children in the school zone because in its programming somewhere, given the choice of hitting a large item or a small item, it hit children? Which of those two do you want to be arguing on the floor of Congress? The facts or 4 dead children? Those are the kinds of things, right? Not to mention hacking and all that type of stuff. So mine is a kind of skeptic of government. It's not about the technology. Mine's the skeptic of government. And it will slow. By the way, how many things have you seen the government speed right along? So historically, just think of drugs. By the way, they should be very careful, right? Think of drugs. Drugs generally come on the market 10 years after there were safe tests. Easily. And they probably should. You can make a very compelling argument. This the same way. That's why I say in the next 5 to 10 years, almost none. I could be wrong. $50 basis points on the short end above inflation. We could argue is inflation 1.8 or 2 or 2.2. 50 basis points around something like inflation. 50 basis points above. Why not? I mean, really? And on the long end, probably on the 10-year, let's say, some number 150 to 200 above inflation. Still pretty cheap. Would still be pretty cheap, absolutely. Grinding it out. Just, I mean this very seriously. I think we're in one of those windows of just grinding it out. I don't really see, I don't really see the seeds of excess yet. And I'm pretty good at seeing seeds of excess. I said them, but in 2006, I said there'd be a recession in 8. It was much deeper than I thought, but you could see fingerprints. I missed the magnitude, but I got the timing. And you go back. It's not I'm perfect. That's not the point. I just don't see fingerprints. There's not enough leverage out there. There's too much capacity out there. There's not enough exuberance out there. When things bad tend to happen is when there are a lot more money than brains, and people believe trees grow to the sky. Most don't believe trees grow to the sky except in tech. And most people do not yet have more money than brains in the way we were talking about. They've got money, but it's commensurate to their brains, right? And by the way,
I know some people who have more money
well,
than
there's
brains.
some. You know, Steve Roth of Vornado had a great line once to me, which was, the problem is not when you see people doing dumb things, because people always do dumb things. It's when smart people are compelled to do dumb things because others are saying, if they don't, they've missed the boat. That was kind of Warren Buffett's conundrum during the dot-com, right? Of, not going to jump on the ship, but if I don't, is there a run on me?
You got to put up with a lot of noise.
You got to put up, and I don't see that, quote, a lot of smart people doing really dumb things. You can always, but. Will there ever be a politician in this country who will face up to having to cut entitlements as the deficit grows? Yes, but not for another 5 to 10 years. No, it has nothing to do with the current set of politicians. It has to do with the mountain of the phenomena. It's, by the way, the Social Security program, for example, is still positive cash flow. That is, there's more money coming in than going out, okay? No, I say, but how many of you in your business deal with a problem that's not going to be a problem for 10 years and is cash flowing now? You got enough other problems, right? So you focus on them. In that sense, not for 5 to 10 years. When it becomes seriously cash flow negative, then they're going to have to. And fortunately, most of the tweaks are kind of easy, and some are creative. I'm working on one. When I say working on, you know, some of you may have introduced incentivized health plans where we actually pay you not to smoke, and so. And what everybody finds is they pay for themselves and then some. A couple of you are nodding your heads. You know what I'm talking about. If you switched Medicare, just switched Medicare to such a plan, and it had the similar, not even perfect, similar traits as corporations have had, you would get a huge windfall because those plans more than pay for themselves, even though you're paying people the medical. So I think it's not going to be so much cut per se as reimagine certain things. And I think in the medical, it's going to be along that line. On the Social Security, it's going to just be technical. You're going to raise the retirement age, and you're going to, and so forth and so on. You're not going to cut. Cut is hard, right? Because you're walking to somebody without grandfathering, I mean, it's hard. So, but I don't think the day of reckoning is for another 5 to 10 years. I wish it were 10 years ago, but I just don't think the political, and I say, I'm not talking about the Democrats and Republican and president of now. I think it doesn't matter who the president.
Where did we hit the wall with the deficit? 30 trillion, 20 trillion?
Well, we're only about 15 trillion. Well, 5 of that is left-hand, right-hand debt. That's 5 of it is we owe it to the government owes it to themselves. So that's an intercompany loan. 15 trillion is not intercompany. And half of that is owned by foreigners, so we'll be happy to stiff them if the moment ever came.
On that note, you have to catch a plane to Hanoi.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.